On Sunday, September 21st, we have the new moon solar eclipse happening at 29 degrees of Virgo. And this is actually the second new moon that we've had this year in the sign of Virgo. The first one happened back on August 23rd at 0 degrees of Virgo. So it's kind of like this is a more mature Virgo new moon. And this is actually the last eclipse that we get of 2025. So pay attention. Now, before you picture these big dramatic skies, let me kind of ground you a little bit. This is only a partial solar eclipse, and even then, it's only going to be visible in parts of the Southern Hemisphere, particularly Antarctica. So, for the rest of us, this is just like functionally a supercharged new moon. So try to think of this as more of like a reset point rather than a big external cosmic event. This is also a south node solar eclipse, meaning it's less about manifesting things out of like thin air, and it's more about like letting go and clearing things out and closing cycles in order to make space for what's ahead. So if you're curious about what to expect for this eclipse season and for the rest of 2025, then be sure to like and subscribe down below so you can stay updated on what's going on in the sky. And also, if you're new here, hi, I'm Mackenzie, aka Astromac, and I'm a professional astrologer, and I talk all things astrology on this channel. And I also have a Patreon where if you join, you get access to a group Discord, and I also offer a bunch of different astrology readings. So if you're interested in any of that, I'll link all of that down below. So now, before we get any further, let's pull up the chart for this solar eclipse happening in Virgo and dive right in. So let's break down the astrology of this lunation. So starting off, what is a solar eclipse? So basically, a solar eclipse is like a really supercharged and intense new moon. And a new moon is when the sun and the moon come together in the sky and they form a conjunction, and they signal the beginning of new cycles. During a solar eclipse, though, it's when the sun, moon, and earth align just right. And so when the sun and the moon are conjunct in the sky, it's kind of like the moon comes between Earth and the sun, and it temporarily blocks out the sun's light from hitting Earth. And like I said earlier, this eclipse that's happening on the 21st is only a partial solar eclipse, so only part of the sun will appear to be blocked out. And if you watched my last video about the Pisces lunar eclipse, then you'll remember that the reason that we don't get solar eclipses and lunar eclipses during every month, like during every full moon and new moon, it's because the moon's orbit around Earth is on a 5-degree tilt. So these eclipses only happen when the sun, moon, and earth are aligned just right, and that's indicated by the lunar nodes. And so right now we've got those lunar nodes transiting Pisces and Virgo, that Pisces-Virgo axis about body, mind, spirit. So for this eclipse, it will only be visible in parts of the Southern Hemisphere, like I said, including New Zealand, Eastern Australia, the South Pacific Islands, and Antarctica. And even in those places, it's only a partial eclipse, and that's because this eclipse is happening about 10 degrees away from those lunar nodes. So the intensity is not as strong as it would be for like a total solar eclipse, like if this lunation was exactly conjunct the south node, but it's still going to be like a more intense, like supercharged new moon. So with new moons, they tend to signal new beginnings, and they signal the beginning of new cycles. But with this being a south node solar eclipse and also an eclipse happening at the 29th degree, I kind of was viewing this as like a new cycle around something that we've already started to build. And so it's like we're just like building on something that we've already started, but in this process that of building, it's kind of like we have to let go of some things and clear out some of the junk and clear out some of the clutter in order to kind of keep moving forward and continue building on that. The final degree of any sign, being the 29th degree, means it's considered anaretic. So there's this sense of like maturity or culmination. And with this 29th degree, it just means it's like the full maturity of this sign, and it's at its like peak expression, really. So those Virgo themes of like health and well-being and our body-mind connection and our habits and our routines and our rituals and utilizing our discernment and common sense and our problem-solving skills and just that like attention to detail, all of those things are going to be at like peak expression, and they're going to be really highlighted. And so as we're kind of reaching that edge of Virgo territory, being that 29th degree before we move into the next sign, it's kind of like we're being asked, what do you need to perfect or refine or release or let go of in this area of your life? I was kind of viewing it as how we're like pruning or trimming away the excess and getting rid of things that aren't necessary on our journey forward. Because again, Virgo is all about like refinement and discernment and purifying and simplifying. And it's also about tidying up and like making systems more efficient and more effective. And if you watched my Virgo 101 video, then you'll remember how I talked about Virgo is all about like making decisions and how it's also associated with the harvest. And so with Virgo, it's kind of like we have to make those hard decisions sometimes. And so we have to decide like what's helpful and what's useful to us and what's not. And we have to decide like what works for us and what no longer does. And so on a personal level, that's like what we're doing in our personal lives. You know, it's like we're simplifying and purifying and refining our lives and deciding what works for us and what's useful for us and what no longer is. And so like I said earlier, this is not like a brand new beginning type of new moon like it was last month being at 0 degrees, but with this new moon, it's like we already have our rough draft. And so for this new moon, it's like we're editing that and refining it and simplifying it and making it better and getting rid of the fluff and getting rid of the excess and getting rid of what we don't need in order to, you know, reach our final draft, really. Like, don't get me wrong, this is still new beginning energy, but it's not like brand new, if that makes sense. It's kind of like it's something that we've already been working on and something that we've already been watering. And so now we're just kind of like fine tuning it and tweaking it a little bit. And it's something that we'll continue working on and continue watering over the next 6 months. And so this could have to do with like us wanting to do something more practical with our Piscean dreams or kind of refining and fine-tuning those dreams. Like think back to that Pisces lunar eclipse that happened a couple of weeks ago. You know, things were being illuminated to us in a big way and we were kind of asked to just kind of like go with the flow of that energy, you know, not resist and just surrender to what's being illuminated to us. And now with this Virgo new moon, it's kind of like figuring out what it is that you want to do with these things that were illuminated during either that Pisces lunar eclipse or just over the course of this eclipse season. And so maybe it's like we realize how our dreams or how like our gifts of compassion or spiritual connection can be used to be more helpful and healing in some way. Because Virgo is all about kind of like taking those big Piscean dreams and bringing them to reality and putting them to practical use and being of service in that way. And with this being an eclipse, you know, this is not something that we really have to try and like force to happen. You know, this is just something like the Virgo area of our life is being refined and purified and simplified and pruned by this eclipse. So I was really feeling like the big theme for this one is that we're going to kind of have to let go of the need to control, which is not necessarily easy for Virgo energy because it's like with Virgo, we want to kind of control things down to like the minute little details. But you know, not everything goes to plan, and eclipse seasons tend to be, again, these times of change, and so we're just kind of being asked to release control and move with that flow. I really feel like this theme of like letting go and releasing control is being highlighted and emphasized even more because it is a South Node eclipse. And when the South Node is involved, it tends to involve like stirring up the past a little bit. And when the past gets stirred up, you know, some things get brought up to the surface, but they're being brought up to be let go of and to be released. And so that could be like old patterns or old cycles, whether it's like, you know, our habits or like maybe you have this thought pattern that like when you're triggered, like you immediately go to like this very limiting belief. And so that might get triggered under this new moon eclipse, but it could also be like even old relationships get stirred up or old feelings that are pertaining to those relationships get stirred up, or like maybe you have this tendency to being like hypercritical of yourself, or maybe you have these perfectionist tendencies. Or again, it could be like letting go of the need to control situations that are definitely outside of your control, or, you know, again, it could be like habits, and habits come in all shapes and sizes. Like sometimes it's a thought habit that you have over and over again that's not even true, or maybe you have this habit of like, you know, doom scrolling. I definitely do that. Or maybe it's habits pertaining to your health and overall well-being, or maybe it's like your routines and your rituals, or maybe it pertains to your work life and your work dynamics. And so all of these things could kind of resurface under this new moon eclipse, but they're being surfaced in order to be cut out and released from our lives. And so as you're releasing these things and letting go of these things that no longer serve you, I think it's also important to realize that like at one point these things did serve you. And so honoring them in that way and just kind of like recognizing like at one point these things did help me, but now they don't. Now they're kind of holding me back. And so honoring them in that way and not judging yourself for, having these things in your life still. And also like what did you learn from these things and how did they serve you at one point and how might they be holding you back now and what can you replace those things with now moving forward in a way that is more aligned with where you're wanting to go. And with this being a new moon, it is a time to be more introspective and more reflective. And so just being open to whatever this lunation is trying to show you. So if you can just kind of like put on your observation cap and just pay attention and notice the things that are coming up for you and really utilizing your discernment and your common sense. Like honestly, this would be a great time for doing some journaling and just some like really deep self-reflection and just like being honest with yourself and maybe asking yourself like what kind of Virgo tendencies do I tend to like overdo, whether it be that perfectionism or that hypercriticism, or maybe you get really reactive when it feels like too much is outside of your control and so you might like use your words and lash out at people, or maybe you have this tendency to like really obsess on the small things and like those really minor things that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And so just really paying attention and observing what's coming up for you during this eclipse and just kind of observing yourself a little bit and being a little more introspective and reflective, because this eclipse, again, it's here to help us prune and trim away and cut away the things that no longer serve us. And Virgo has this way of kind of being able to cut out with extreme precision. And so it's kind of like all of those things that are unnecessary or unhelpful to us will be cut away during this eclipse. But it's happening so that we can move forward feeling lighter and more aligned. And so on like a very practical level, you could use this time to kind of like tidy up your space and do a bit of a purge and get rid of things that are just like collecting dust that you don't really need. And so doing that physically, whether it's like tidying up your home or it could be your car or your workplace. And then you could also like do it on a mental level, like doing a big brain dump and getting rid of like all that excess mental clutter that's kind of like adding to the mental cobwebs, Or you could do it like on your technology devices, like kind of getting rid of old pictures or emails or, files that you'll never need again and kind of like tidying up that space in that way, And also tending to like your hygiene, whether that's like your physical hygiene as well as like your spiritual hygiene and your energy hygiene. And you're the one who has to be responsible for these things, because we also have an opposition to the planet Saturn in this particular eclipse, and Saturn is that planet of structure and discipline and responsibility, and right now it's moving retrograde and it's recently back in Pisces. So I really feel like that spiritual hygiene and that energetic hygiene is going to be a big thing, as well as boundaries. And boundaries are a huge thing with our energy hygiene if you think about it. And so it's like we're being asked to really take responsibility for these boundaries in our life and take responsibility for our habits and our routines and our rituals and take responsibility for our well-being, really. And I feel like when we think about boundaries, we tend to think about those boundaries within relationships and like what we allow and what kind of treatment we allow from other people. And that's a huge thing. That's a huge part of it. But it's also the boundaries that we have with ourselves. And so this is a time to really reflect and be honest with yourself, how you're spending your time and what kind of habits that you have and what kind of routines are you investing in, and also reflecting on like what you're allowing into your life. And that includes like the media that you're taking in and like the people you're checking in on, or it also includes like how you're just taking care of like your body, mind, and spirit. And so really taking responsibility for those things. And with that Virgo energy coming in, it's coming in to kind of decide what is helpful and healing and useful to you and what's not, and letting go of that. And you have to take responsibility in letting go of that. And so if you have this awareness that there's something in your life that is like no longer helpful to you or no longer useful, and instead it's actually like holding you back and keeping you small, and yet you still continue to seek it out, or like whatever it might be. It's kind of like you're the one who has to really take responsibility for that and set that boundary. And setting that boundary is a huge part of that energy hygiene that we were just talking about. And this has not been an easy eclipse season, so first and foremost, give yourself a lot of grace and compassion, and be gentle with yourself, and kind of, try not to judge yourself, because when we judge ourselves, that means that there's a part of us that we're not quite accepting. And so when we can learn to accept all parts of ourselves and not judge ourselves for being human, really, because no one is perfect. We're all just humans trying our best. So just keep that in mind. But when we can learn to really accept all parts of ourselves, that's what makes like those personal changes and those personal transformations a little easier. Because when we're accepting of ourselves, that means that when we're going through these changes, it's not coming from this perspective of like guilt and shame and judgment. It's coming from like this loving, compassionate, and accepting angle. And so if that's something that you really struggle with, maybe that's what you're releasing under this new moon, is releasing like that self-judgment. Because when you can do it from this like loving perspective of like, I love myself and I accept myself so much that I'm willing to make these changes in order to better myself, that's what makes that lasting change. And it's not like these changes are going to happen overnight and these things are going to manifest in a week. Because whenever Saturn's involved, it's really teaching us these lessons of patience and discipline. And so with setting boundaries as well, that takes like, you got to have a little bit of discipline, and it takes practice and doing it over and over again before you become like a master in setting those boundaries. And so we're really being asked to take responsibility and take accountability for our habits and our routines and our rituals in our lives, and take responsibility for our energy hygiene and those boundaries again. So really like taking accountability for those routines in our lives and reflecting on if those habits are really supporting our long-term growth, or if we're just kind of like micromanaging ourselves into a state of exhaustion. Because I think a large part of like boundaries as well is, knowing when you've kind of reached your limit and really allowing yourself to rest and recuperate. We also have an out of sign opposition to the planet Neptune, which is retrograde in Aries right now, and it's less than a degree away, so it's still a pretty strong opposition. But whenever Neptune's involved, it kind of like blurs the edges and it makes things foggy, and it adds like this layer of confusion. So it's kind of like we're maybe not seeing things the most clear right now. This is another reason to give yourself a lot of grace and compassion right now. Neptune is that planet all about compassion. And so like depending on where this eclipse is happening for you and where Neptune is transiting for you, things might feel kind of confusing or foggy right now. And whenever I see a Neptune transit, my best advice is to just like take that very next step. Like you don't necessarily need to know the next 10, 15, 20 steps in front of you. You just need to first take that first step and then keep taking that step, one step into the unknown. And then that's how you kind of get to where you're going. So this is a time to really get in touch with what it is that you truly want. And so with that, get in touch with your values. And I talked about this on my Patreon, but with Venus transiting Virgo right now, this is a time to get really clear and kind of refine your values and kind of use your values as your inner guiding compass. And so with that like Neptune fogginess of it all, when you kind of know your values and you know what you desire and you know what you want, that makes it easier to kind of take that first step in a desired direction. And eventually those steps add up and you end up getting somewhere, And so this is a time to really focus on the progress that you've already made and kind of like reflecting back and, not just focusing on like past failures or anything, but rather learning from those failures and remembering how far you've come. Because sometimes our failures really are our best teachers, and they just kind of have this way of redirecting us in a way. And I know with the Virgo energy, we're all wanting to be a little more perfect right now, but just recognizing that no one is perfect and nothing is perfect. And so not being afraid to make mistakes along our journey and along our path. And so, like I said earlier, with this new moon, it's kind of like we already have a well-developed rough draft. And so, under this new moon, we're just kind of editing and refining and adding in those final touches. There's definitely still this new beginning kind of energy that I'm picking up on, but it's kind of like this new beginning that is building on something that we've already started again. And so it's a time to remain open and receptive rather than trying to force any kind of new beginning to be birthed. And so reflecting on some collective themes that might come up on or around or in the months coming up after this eclipse, I definitely think like health systems and public health debates could reach a moment of like reevaluation. And so I'm definitely keeping my eye on RFK Jr. and what's going on with him. I don't know what to potentially expect, but I do think that he'll be in the news a lot more. And I think that COVID is definitely going to continue to be a big thing. And with this being a solar eclipse, and so that means that the sun is eclipsed by the moon, the sun typically represents like people who are leaders or people who are in positions of power. And so I don't know if that could mean like someone's stepping down, like people are stepping down from their positions of power, or they're resigning, or whatever it might be. And another like larger transit that we're dealing with that is still present during this eclipse is Uranus in Gemini, trine Pluto in Aquarius. And so I think this speaks to like science and technology breakthroughs, and it could even be like a metaphysical thing as well. But just these breakthroughs that disrupt these old ways of doing things. And so on a personal level, this is a reminder that we're in the middle of some big changes, both collectively and personally. And so we're being asked to kind of release control and surrender and go with the flow. And so on a personal level, the way that you can best move with this energy is to let go of those things that no longer serve you and, release those old patterns that are coming up to be released, and release those patterns of perfectionism or being overly judgmental of yourself, or releasing that hypercriticism, and even releasing old anxieties, and setting boundaries with yourself and not overworking yourself to a point of exhaustion. This is also a time to really simplify our lives. Virgo loves to organize, and so sometimes it's like less is more. And so this is a time to declutter all areas of life, like physically, like our homes, or mentally, like doing a brain dump. And this is a great time to journal and do a lot of self-reflection and simplify in that way. Or maybe it's like simplifying your routines, like maybe you're doing too much, and so you gotta like kind of come back to what is essential to your overall health and well-being and kind of cutting out the rest. This is a time where you also want to be grounding yourself. I feel like I say this all the time, but grounding is so important, especially during eclipse season, because eclipses can feel really ungrounding and chaotic and just really like making us like scatter our energy a little bit, but you really want to keep coming back to the present moment over and over again. And so maybe that's like through your breath, or maybe like drinking something really cold, or maybe it's like eating something sour, whatever helps bring you back to the present moment. And so anchoring yourself in these small daily rituals, whether that's like starting your day with lighting a candle and focusing and centering your energy that way, or maybe it's like getting outside and, getting into nature and observing wildlife and like going down a nature path, it could be a bunch of different ways. There's a lot of like reflective energy for this eclipse as well. And so really reflecting on like your responsibilities and your boundaries, and reflecting on if those are aligned with your dreams or are they kind of draining you. It's a time to reevaluate our habits and our routines and our rituals as well, and reflect on if they are helpful to us and they like help and serve our overall health and well-being, or if they hinder that in some way. And then taking responsibility for, what we do with that information. This is also a time where you want to be tending to your overall like energy hygiene. And so that goes for like physical hygiene, like, taking care of your physical body, but also like mental hygiene, like paying attention to what thoughts you're thinking about yourself as well as others. And also spiritual hygiene, are you meditating and taking good care of like your spiritual self? And also your emotional hygiene. Are you allowing yourself to feel your feelings and, not judging yourself for having those feelings? And this is a time to rest as well. With this being a South Node eclipse, it's probably not going to be the most high energy time. A lot of times when there's a planet near a South Node, it tends to be a time where we feel kind of energetically drained, actually, or we just might feel exhausted. And so this is a time to allow yourself to rest guilt-free and without judgment. So while technically this is a solar eclipse, for most of us it's just going to be experienced as a really intense and powerful new moon, but it's great for letting go of these things that no longer serve us, because it is happening at that 29th degree. And so it's we've reached a culmination and a full maturity moment. And so letting go of those routines and those habits and those perfectionist tendencies and that tendency towards hypercriticism or being overly judgmental of yourself and others, and taking responsibility for your boundaries and for your energy hygiene, just so that you can align with your next highest version of yourself, and aligning with those bigger shifts that are happening in your life. Because remember, eclipse season is this time of change, and so we're all kind of in the middle of a lot of change right now. And so it's we're all kind of being redirected and kind of nudged back onto our path. And so it might be a time where doors are closing but other doors are opening, and chapters are ending but new chapters are beginning. And yeah, I think that's all I've got to say for this particular new moon solar eclipse and eclipse season that we've had. So thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe and share it with some of your fellow astrology loving friends. And yeah, until next time, love you, bye.